Hello there guys and welcome back to the channel. As pretty much everybody is waiting for the huge big announcements from Marvel Concept of Champions team in regards of the future of the game, which are still about a day away, I figured it's a quite good time to reminisce in the best and the worst experiences, and more specifically for today's video, the best and the worst fights I seem to kind of like recall that have left the biggest lasting impression on me as either very great fight designs or extremely awful cheap cash grabby fight designs. Now obviously there are many more fights that could be mentioned, but we're just going to focus on the ones that kind of like left me with the most lasting impression. And number one, I guess this would be the fight from Variant 1, where we have this energized Hyperion. Obviously back in the day it was called Power Gain 100% or something like that. Basically this is just a regular Hyperion that has 100% increased power gain, therefore he will be very tricky to hit, but he also had this Pilfer regeneration node, which effectively had a decent amount of chance to nullify a buff whenever you would gain one and give Hyperion a chunk of power on top of that. Now what made this fight extremely annoying and kind of like detrimental, because your typical counters for Hyperions were not available. You were limited to your Cosmic and Science champions, and by the time Variant 1 came out there was literally one solid counter for this fight, which was in fact Void. And even when you brought in Void, you were somewhat dependent on the RNG when your Petrifies are going to proc, and if you can't have Petrify up quickly you were still likely gonna eat a special 3 to the face. And the situation isn't even much better now. 2 years after this fight has been released, I went through the list of Cosmic and a list of Science champions, and realistically, as like direct counters to this fight, we could list now Mr. Fantastic, perhaps to a degree. I have never actually tried him in this fight, but I think he's kind of like slowing off opponents' defensive power rate in addition to his 35% Petrify debuffs could potentially work in this fight. So I think Mr. Fantastic can do this fight, and potentially She-Hulk if you get a decent enough time proccing your Fury buffs early on. And other than these three things, Void, Mr. Fantastic and She-Hulk, today, 2 years later, there are still no direct counters to this fight. Yes, you can bring in like Luke Cage or Thor or somebody else who has a relatively high chance to stun opponent on level 1 and basically just smash and hope for RNG to get lucky. But this fight design is so utterly bad that even 2 years later there are no real direct counters apart from hope he's super happy to throw those special attacks and hope you can deal a lot of damage in extremely short amount of time before he gets to the level 3 and eats you alive. So I definitely do not like this type of fight design in general. Obviously we can see these increased power gain nodes on Hyperions and Doctor Stranges throughout Act 6 and throughout the Variant 2, I believe, as well it has, but at least they aren't that bad because you can have access to your like magics, you can have access to your Dr. Octopuses, so on and so forth. But this was blatant kind of like power gain cornucopia for Hyperion with no counters kind of like even allowed in, so that definitely did infuriate me quite a bit. And we're gonna get to these guys quite a bit later. Next fight would be from 616, and that would be buffed up Pilfer regeneration Prey on the Weak Sorcerer Symbiote Supreme. Yes, because I recall this is like one of the biggest problem fights today in Act 6.1, and 6.1 came out with like quite big controversy of 4-star champions not being allowed in this quest. Therefore the total pool of champions everybody can utilize was already severely limited. You weren't allowed your 4 or 3-star champions for synergy purposes or for very specific niche fights like this. Again, even to this day there are only about dozen counters that do work relatively well to this fight at the best of conditions. It was pretty much either you have Aegon or Ghost or, you know, Hyperion, a lot of revives, or you're absolutely stopped and screwed, because obviously Symbiote Supreme by definition is eating away all of your buffs which you must obtain, plus there's Pilfer regeneration which gives him more power to spam special attacks, therefore gain more staggers, and you can only deal damage obviously if you have 3 or more buffs active. So I think this is extremely disgusting fight design. I could and would never support anything of the sort, and it's a real shame that it still even exists in this game. But what I think is a bigger shame, that somebody actually came up with this, and then there was somebody who okayed this as being, yeah, that sounds perfectly fine, that's a good fight for summoners to have. No, it isn't. There's nothing really about skill, there's nothing really about kind of like strategy. This fight is literal have and have nots, and even those who have some of the options are often forced to use a whole bunch of resources because you take a whole lot of damage from Symbiote Supreme's ability to nullify. Obviously, how this whole Pilfer is just a giant mess of a fight, and still to this day, to my mind, springs as one of the stupidest fight designs ever released in this game. Moving on from stupid to stupider, obviously, is EMP modification, because this fight literally pretty much embodies fun and interactive damage. it pretty much defines fun and interactive damage, because obviously you do not only have the backblast node, which obviously if you just happen to hit a bit too hard is going to place an incinerate on you, and if you are using fully ranked up champions, it's pretty much anybody on like a decent special crit, so you effectively need like an incinerate immunity, or at least it would be very welcome. Additionally, EMP modification, which places passive shocks, so even champions who could technically shrug off debuffs are not protected here, because the shocks are passive, and it's obviously different type of immunity that's needed. And it's combined with caustic temper, which effectively prevents you from doing any meaningful damage whatsoever unless you have an active fury buff specifically. And additionally, obviously, you need poison immunity, because a couple hits in without poison immunity, you're just going to get poisoned to death. So you needed shock immunity, incinerate immunity, poison immunity, an active fury buff, and the champion had to be a decent counter to Mr. Sinister, which is obviously a very tricky defender. Now, this fight would suck absolute ass if it was, I don't know, Iron Patriot here on the defense, or if it was something else that's ridiculously easy. But adding Mr. Sinister on top of all of these nodes need like an unnecessary insult to the injury, because obviously he heals back pretty much vast majority of the crit damage with his, and if you so happen to die at him, and let's say with the Science Champion, then his regen rate is even increased, and then he can actually regain more health than he takes from these crits, and it's just an absolute shit show. Not to mention that if you do so happen to inflict damage over time debuffs on Mr. Sinister, that you as well kind of need to make sure that you better be immune to those debuffs, because effectively Mr. Sinister has sort of mini clapback mechanic in him where he can throw all of the debuffs back. And again, it's one of the most hated roadblock fights in Mortal Kombat Champions for a reason. And again, I cannot possibly understand what goes through the heads of people who design these fights and think it's a great idea, when realistically, when it came out, we went through all of the champions in the game, and not a single champion individually countered all of the points that were necessary. I think closest to what was needed individually was Captain Marvel movie version, because for 12 seconds she could stack and non-damaging debuffs, thus prevent his heal with Despair Mastery, and kind of like absorb all of the incinerate and passive shock damage with her indestructibility, but it still would most cases result in needing a couple of revives. And now we are quite a while later, we have had a lot more champions added, and individually, a single champion with no synergies, no extra additional setup, there's still not a champion that can answer all of these problems. So I find it, again, extremely poor fight design. And yeah, I think one of my most watched videos on this channel is effectively a how to beat Mr. Sinister video plus a rant of how much this fight sucks. So I think that also tells something about this fight. And yeah, after Mr. Sinister, obviously Act 6 in general, and specifically 6.2, is a treasure trove of god-awful fights, and one of the most memorable ones will be Champion Fight itself. Now, I will be perfectly honest, I don't really have problem with majority of Champion Fight. Champion Fight with vast majority of the nodes, I think it's not a good fight. I think the biggest kind of reason people dislike it is the stupid high block damage and the stupid high uptime of that unstoppable buff. And those are things to be easily mended, but that alone wouldn't, for me personally, kind of rank it as one of the shittiest fights ever designed. The thing that does it is combination with no retreat node, because especially because this seems kind of like a hypocritical fight design. They are telling you, flat out telling you, if you want to win this fight, you have to dex that special attack five times in a very specific, precise manner, which is a hard task in itself. But with no retreat, they're also telling you, but if you so happen to dex, you're going to be taking fun and interactive damage. On top of fun and interactive block damage, on top of fun and interactive unblockable mechanics, on top of fun and interactive this, that, and everything else, and regen. And this fight just has so much of what people hate in it that it's just like a real proper hybrid of most hated things in the community, topped off with additional no retreat node. Is just taking the mickey, in my opinion. But again, champion fight in itself, I think, is a bad design, is a really bad design, but might not necessarily be as awful if there wouldn't be this combination with no retreat, because no retreat is by far the worst champion fight that you can have. All right, and moving on, and you guys didn't think I'm gonna miss this one. Like this fight specifically has hurt my soul so deeply that I have mentioned, talked about it, ranted about it at least a dozen times on this channel. And I still cannot fathom what kind of sociopathic dickhead has to be the said person to design Do You Bleed fight with a rogue on it. And yeah, there's not much I can say. This fight is awful. Sociopath. It's made for a miserable time. It's made for the fight to be horrible. Because only way you do damage is if you bleed the opponent. Obviously, the thing that they don't tell in Do You Bleed node is you can do damage while hitting opponent's blockers, which is how pretty much everybody chooses to conduct this fight if they know that hitting in a block is a viable strategy. But in itself, when you play by rules, when you are do as you told, the fight is just absolutely miserable snooze fest. It's not hard, it's not difficult, it's not challenging, it's not skill intensive. Rogue is an easy opponent to deal with pretty much any champion. There's nothing special about fighting Rogue, and that, in my mind, makes the fight even worse because it's just boring. It's just boring, god dang it. And yeah, I cannot understand why would anybody do this, and not understanding why would anybody do this, we're moving to understanding exactly why would somebody do this, and this is the Acid Wash Mysterio. So effectively, Mysterio is a poison immune champion on a node that requires you to be able to poison this guy. And where I said I wouldn't understand why anybody would put Rogue on Do You Bleed, because I'm generally a mess. Like, I don't know why would anybody do that. At least for Acid Wash Mysterio, I know exactly why somebody did it, and I know it is because they wanted to sell some Man-Thing hype and Man-Thing crystals, because this fight came around pretty much exactly the same time as Man-Thing did, and Man-Thing is pretty much the only champion in the entire game that can, quote-unquote, play by the rules here and inflict the armor break to remove the Mysterio's poison immunity and then inflict poison. Obviously we have King Groot, but I have seen screenshots of people doing like 1500 hits with King Groot, and I do not consider King Groot as a viable counter to this fight just because of how pathetic King Groot is and the fact that nobody would realistically kind of like use him, or yeah, if I had the choice of using King Groot or I don't know, Ghost or Aegon or some other high damage output champion and treat this as a Labyrinth of Legends fight, I wouldn't bring in King Groot. So effectively, in my mind, Man-Thing still to this day is like only effective solution for this fight, and that's disgusting. That's intellectually dishonest and disgusting. Designing a fight intentionally where you have only one viable counter, not to have completely miserable time, and it just so happened to coincide with the release of this one counter, and at the time when these Man-Thing Cavalier crystals are available for sale. Just despicable business practices with very dodgy and sociopathic node design. So that's all I'm going to say here, because this is an embarrassment for Kabam. If I was Kabam, I would rush to change this fight, because every time I look at this fight in particular, I feel embarrassed for Kabam, because it's blatantly obvious what they were trying to do. Everybody hates it, and it should be shameful. It should be changed. And another fight that I personally obviously didn't have that much of an issue with, but I can definitely understand where the awful fight design here comes from. And this is the Darkhawk, because he obviously starts the entire bit completely unblockable. That alone messes up people, because if you mess with the default opening, which would be parry going into the combo, it makes for a really hard time. Any fight where unconditionally you must start with an intercept typically is going to be considered quote-unquote a hard fight. And I wouldn't necessarily have that big of an issue with it if it wouldn't be Darkhawk, or if his attack wouldn't be as jacked up, because obviously Darkhawk has unavoidable, pretty much undexable level 1. With jacked up attack, it absolutely eats your health in the chip damage. You can block a handful of level 1s and you're done, you're toast. So what is your alternative? Your alternative would be to push him to level 2, but wait, then he goes into his stealth mode, or whatever that mode's name is, and then you effectively can't fight him normally because you will be missing a lot of hits, and again, kind of parrying and waiting it out isn't really an option. Obviously, there's also limitations of Darkhawk in itself, where you do not want to be knocking him down and letting him change his modes, and he will end up regening a lot of health, and all in all these things combined kind of go where he is unblockable, he can phase your hits, he gives you so much, pretty much unavoidable block damage, or at the very least, very RNG reliant block damage. And on top, to insult the injury, they also gave him like power reserve, where he can throw way more special attacks than normal champion should be able to, and that just only kind of serves to increase amount of the block damage and makes this fight even more miserable time. And like when you look at this fight decently, like from a realistic standpoint, there's only like a handful of good counters for this fight. But the most common strategy is just bring in Ghost, bring in Corvus, and do as much damage as you can before you die. And that's not good. That's definitely not a good fight design. Another fight that I definitely wanted to mention before I give out some credit fights and fights that I think have been absolutely fantastic would be the Agent Venom from Labyrinth. Now, I know majority of you will not have the experience of how it was to deal with Agent Venom in Labyrinth of Legends when Labyrinth came out, because obviously the champion choice was a lot more limited, and we had far less good or great champions. 3 million health is a huge amount today, but keep in consideration that we hardly had any of the popular high damage output champions that we do today, and realistically there was only kind of like Star-Lord available. I know Rocket Raccoon was a legit hard-hitting viable option for Labyrinth back in the day. And that about explains you how dire the choices that we had, basically. And not only this guy had the big health pool of 3 million, which was absolutely unfathomable, he also had this node which made it extremely difficult to avoid taking a lot of incinerate damage. And here is where the two big problems obviously come in, because when this guy came out, I think we had either none or 1 or 2 Incinerate Immune champions. I don't remember whether Iceman was already released, and I also think that Mephisto might... No, I don't think Mephisto was there. I think Iceman was like first Incinerate Immune champion, or one of the first ones, or like Vulture, but those champions absolutely stink. So anyways, we had pretty much no Incinerate Immune options, and we also had no viable champions that could like effectively bypass this Incinerate, like we have now Ghost or Aegon, who can just immediately shrug these abilities off. So this was a fight against a very hard opponent who obviously has Limber active, who has a chance to evade, who has tenacity, so you can shrug off all of your debuffs. So again, that eliminates a subset of champions that you could use. And you had like no other option but to bring in like your Star-Lord anyways and just eat a whole lot of Incinerate damage when you miscalculated by a microsecond. And yes, there are a couple of solos on YouTube with like a rank 4 Star-Lord and a rank 5 Star-Lord, but those are so rare, and to be able to do that, it's kind of like quite insane level of skill. And for vast majority of the cases, for years after Labyrinth came out, this fight was pretty much considered to be the money pit, because no champions could like, the 3 million health already was a huge obstacle and hurdle in vast majority of the fights. Add in pretty much unavoidable block damage if he happens to throw level 1s. Add in the limber, add in a wade chance, and add in losing your health to incinerate as well in quite rapid pace. And it just made for a very, very kind of like miserable time. So I definitely did want to put this fight out in particular. I think the rest of the fights in Labyrinth of Legends could be dealt with easier. Like, yes, Juggernaut was extremely hard, but at least the mistakes you made in Juggernaut fight were when you got hit in the face, not when you took fun and interactive incinerate damage. But yeah, anyway, so let's move on to some of the better and good examples. And obviously, as we finish off, obviously, this cannot be complete by complete opposites of Collector and Grandmaster. In my head, right now, Collector presents two of the worst designed fights in the game, period. Because once you think about it, both Collector fights are extremely similar. Both the Collector fights feature unavoidable block damage, because those special attacks are just not meant to be evaded by mere mortals. Both of those fights feature your ability accuracy reduction, I believe. Both of those fights feature him being able to shrug off debuffs. Both of those fights feature him going unstoppable. And then there's some region involved, and then there's a whole lot of other things happening. And the intent behind of these fights, you cannot hide the dollar signs in the eyes of the person who designed Collector fights. That's undeniable, it's undisputable. Every single thing that's hard, tricky, annoying, or hated by players is represented in either of the two Collector fights, whether in 5.2 or whether in Abyss of Legends. To a point where Abyss of Legends Collector obviously is quite impressive with his health pool as well. So that huge health pool combined with such a toxic and nasty combination that pretty much destroys the soul of willpower of the players can only be designed if you're how blinded yourself with dollar signs. There is not a single person alive on this earth that I have met and would say that yes, Collector fight is a good design, or it's fun, or it's interesting fight, or I really felt challenged, you know, because that's what it was meant to represent. Collector fight was this big bad boss that you went and had to beat to get uncollected, which for the highest, well, for a really long time was the highest kind of like honor or highest badge you could earn in this game. But nobody felt challenged, nobody felt accomplished, everybody felt cheated, everybody felt abused, and everybody felt destroyed by Collectors. Because, yeah, again, I haven't met a single person ever, anywhere, who I have spoken with about this fight. I would say it was a good fight, or it was an enjoyable fight, or it was an enjoyable experience. Yes, now 3 years later, when we have far higher ranked champions, people can go in 5.2 and solo the fight. But keep in mind that's with like maxed out 5 stars. When this fight came out, our highest available level of champions was rank 3 5 stars or maxed out 4 stars. And yes, there are some like good results, but typically it's just disgustingly awful. That's all I can say about this guy. And obviously Abyss of Legends is pretty much the same. It goes kind of like, if you do not have Aegon, you're going to suffer a lot. Even with Aegon, you're going to suffer. But if you do not have Aegon, you're going to suffer a whole lot. Then if you haven't brought Corvus with you, which is another champion that would be realistically quite viable for that fight, you will just hate the fact that you even tried or thought about doing Abyss. Abyss is already very roster-centric, and making the final boss again kind of like, use one of these two champions or prepare for extra $100 fee to finish the quest that you've already conquered. It's just disgusting. Like it's not great. It's not great at all. But that will do for like the negative bit. Obviously, there are many awful fights that I could expand upon, but I don't want to spend this entire time just kind of purely ranting about bad things. I also want to kind of like showcase the positive fights and the things that I definitely have enjoyed, and then mine. And that's the thing. Like, if the fight is well made, you're not really gonna remember it because you enjoyed it, you moved past it. If the fight is awful, you're gonna remember it for a really long time. And the fight has to be exceptionally great to kind of like stick in your memory as a really good fight. And the exceptionally great fight designs have been mainly limited to an extra step that Kabam has made in past, and that would be the Grandmaster. Obviously, the Grandmaster fight is an exclusive fight. It defies the rules. It completely kind of like, let's say, quote unquote, reinvents the game and works on its own mechanics. So this is a clear example of where Kabam has gone the extra step to provide a special experience, and that's appreciated. I think universally, currently, if you were to do a poll, which is your favorite fight in MCOC, only including the people who actually have done the Grandmaster fight, vast majority of them would say it's the Grandmaster fight. And now, has the Grandmaster fight been easy? No. Have people been spending more units on Grandmaster fight than many people spent on Abyss Collectors or a lot of other of these bullshit fights? Yes. But there is a one key difference. The Grandmaster fight serves as a reality check. There is nothing particularly cash grabby about Grandmaster fight. There is no unavoidable damage. There's no unavoidable death. There is no randomly RNG, he evaded and he hit me in the face, or he randomly went unstoppable. There's none of that. The fight is perfect environment of a controlled kind of like, here's your task and you have to accomplish it. Here's your task, you have to accomplish it. Here are the rules of the fight. You follow them, you get rewarded with very generous damage boost, which I think was a brilliant touch to kind of like reverse the whole idea of not that we are dealing 90% damage less, but the opponent has effectively 10 times more health. And if we're doing everything right, we're dealing these big, beautiful numbers. Because in theory, they could have just made where entire fight we're dealing 90% less damage, and when we accomplish these tasks, we can deal out normal damage. And that wouldn't psychologically work nearly as well as having Collector 10 million health points, and then us having that huge damage boost and us seeing those big yellow numbers worked on us. Because I think that was a very clever kind of like quote-unquote like trick or manipulation of people's psyche, where it's much easier to get excited when you see very big yellow numbers you otherwise wouldn't see, as opposed to where you see very pathetic tiny numbers throughout the entire fight, and then seeing the regular damage output in these very specific set of conditions. So I think that was a brilliant mind play by Kabam, and it took me a tiny bit to realize that they effectively inversed their acid wash idea, just other way around. Instead of us doing 90% less damage, so basically doing 1/10 of our damage, they just gave Collector 10 times more health, and then gave us an option to bring our damage to, let's say, quote-unquote, a normal standard, which I find enjoyable. I realize that I have been, like, let's say, quote-unquote, emotionally manipulated, but I still enjoyed it, therefore I'm not upset about it. But the best thing about it, obviously, the fact that, yes, this fight was a mirror in front of every player. This fight was a direct representation of where you are currently, your ability to adapt, your ability to react, and your ability to kind of like follow the rules and effectively check how skillful you are and how well you can play this game. Because this allowed you to bring in any champion, so that didn't matter. Strategy and planning wasn't as important, or having the perfect counter was non-existent issue. Everybody can go in and do this fight if you can get to it. And the entire fact that the entire fight is structured by a set of rules that are fair, and that you are able to directly influence the outcome of this fight purely by the skill and of your gameplay, and pretty much take RNG aspects out of this fight. There are no random evades, or you don't feel cheated by these 3% Black Widow evade chance or whatever. No random unstoppables, no retreat, no incredible chip damage and blocked by unavoidable special attacks. None of that. It's just you and the task that is given to you in the fight, and it's kind of like very well designed in the sense that you always have to mix it up. You need to keep the level 1s in mind, and you have the other missions that you need to do, and there are fights, there are changing modes throughout the fight where you have to kind of like, you don't get stale in the fight, you don't get bored because your goals keep changing. So yeah, absolutely love this fight. I think it's a masterpiece. And another masterpiece I cannot unfortunately showcase would be the Nameless Thanos fight, I forgot actually to find a picture of it, but Nameless Thanos was a brilliant fight with a very, very similar kind of like thought process behind it. There were given set abilities, goals, and instructions. You could effectively use pretty much any champion to do those fights, and there was very little in terms of RNG that you had to depend on. And obviously there were better and worse options, just like Grandmaster fight, but effectively that fight could have been done with anyone, and I mean anyone. And Nameless Thanos, I think we have had total of 3 variations of Nameless Thanos by now. And those fights are brilliant. And that is what we need more. I do understand we can't get it every quest, because it looks like a lot of work. Thinking how much thought process and coding and everything else has gone into these fights. I can understand we can't get them all the time, but at the same time I would like them to be brought back on consistent kind of like rotating basis. I don't say design me a new Nameless Thanos or Grandmaster every month, but give us a chance to fight these guys, because they are really, really fun to fight. For the pure aspect of playing MCOC and doing nothing else but just having unfiltered amounts of fun in the game, I think this is as good as this game can get. The Grandmaster, the Nameless Thanos, so on and so forth. And I think they're healthy to increase player skill level. I think it's healthy to have a reality check on some people who claim who are maybe thinking that they're not skilled but they can surprise themselves, or some people who claim to be the best in the world but can't get the fight down and they end up complaining about when there is nothing to complain about. So I think it's a very important function that these fights can fulfill in contest, and I urge these fights to return in greater and bigger numbers. And a couple more fights I wanted to mention. Definitely, I found, for instance, Variant 3 Conk boss to be extremely exciting fight. Now, there are many fights who deserve a shout and who are kind of good by design. I'm going to just briefly explain why I absolutely loved this Conk fight in the Variant 3. And the reason for it is because every single time Selecto Time Stream was about to refresh, you put everything on the line. And there is a lot of excitement, because the fight isn't hard, but the fight is very strict and very harsh. Kang isn't a hard opponent to fight. Obviously there's a lot of chip damage, but effectively it's just a single beam special one. There's no evade, there's no unstoppable, there's no crazy animations. It's a relatively simple fight, but what's enjoyable about it is how unforgiving it is. You can't have spent 15 revives chipping him down bit by bit or whatever, and it basically goes down to, if you miss the one time, none of it matters, and you go back up to full health. And that's exhilarating, that's exciting, and I also kind of wish that we get more of similar thought process here, where this is one of the very few fights where the fight is basically on a pass-fail basis, and the consequences of this fight will have a direct effect of what you have been able to do in the previous fights effectively. And in itself, the fight didn't feel like cheap or casual, because you obviously had to have a plan what to do, and most importantly, you had to be able to stick to your plan, and you had to be precise in your timing. So definitely could appreciate that. I love this Conk fight, and the selective time stream node in general I think is a very beautiful design. Now, I don't want to see it everywhere in every quest, so on and so forth, but I think it's great. And I wanted to give a quick shout out to energy adoption nodes, because I think these are the best nodes Kabam has made in last year or two. I think the fact that these debuffs can come in thick and heavy, but are actual debuffs that are able to trigger willpower, they're energy based, they interact with champions' immunities and champion abilities, and most importantly, it's not like Biohazard or Caustic Temper or something like that, where you get a single one of these debuffs. Yes, they do damage to you, but they do not overwhelm you, and getting a couple of them does not immediately mean you're gonna die. The amount of damage you get from these energy adoption nodes is actually quite small, and it only has like significant impact on your health pool when you accumulate these. So this provided players with ability to use the debuffs to their advantage, to have them interact with willpower heal, especially if your champions had some sort of increased energy resistance, or to have them fuel abilities like, I don't know, Mole Man, like Havoc, so on and so forth. So there are a lot of very, very interesting kind of like things and aspects about these energy adoption nodes that I absolutely love. I find semi-brilliant, kind of like, I don't know, genius level node design, where we finally have nodes that penalize you, how ways to shut them off if you are inflicting correct debuffs on the opponent, how ways to like penalize you again, like by giving opponents regeneration, but then it in itself is something you can use and abuse. So there are like, I don't know, half a dozen champions and different interactions that I can come up with top of my mind that I would absolutely love to test out in like a vacuum environment using these energy adoption nodes. So I find them quite fascinating. So I wanted to give a shout out for that. It's kind of like a quick note that Kabam is in fact capable of designing really, really beautiful nodes and beautiful lanes and beautiful fights. And I will not be talking about Alliance War and Alliance Quest finals because obviously there is a lot of problems with that as well. I think Mojo on Flow is quite disgusting thing, as well as I think that Thing Mini Boss 2 in map 7 is extremely disgusting node design. I think that person who put extra block penetration in Dr. Doom boss in map 7 is again sociopathic asshole. But I'll leave all that slide. This video is kind of like more or less for the permanent content, but this is also going to be more or less it about the video today. So I certainly hope that you guys have enjoyed it. Let me know which fights did you like and which fights did you hate the most in Marvel Concept Champions. Now think it over while you are being mesmerized by the beauty of this tiny little creature. And yeah, as you do that, hit that like button, hit that sub button, hit all the buttons. Don't forget to head down to the comment section, and I'm gonna catch you guys soon. See ya.